So let's talk through Games Workshop's latest Metawatch article, a bunch of discussion about their latest changes, and confirming that game-wide rules and points changes will be coming in January. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about Games Workshop's latest Metawatch article that they've published. Maybe not the most groundbreaking changes in this one, and not quite as interesting as the one where they actually revealed the balanced data slate changes, but still there were a few interesting hints and teasers, and just their general approach to how they're maintaining the game of 40k as a whole. As with the past few articles, this one seems to be a fairly regular series now with Games Workshop's Metawatch. They previously had a few posts of it for Warhammer 40k earlier in the year, but very sporadic and a bit scattergun. And to be honest, it is quite refreshing to have Games Workshop talk about their actual plan for making balance in 40k better, and in a far more intelligent way than they ever used to in the past, to be honest. Even if game balance in 40k is never going to be perfect, at least it's kind of nice to know that the general aim is going to be to make as many units in as many codexes usable, and also to repeatedly try and shore up the weakest factions while reining in the strongest. I feel like as a series it's always going to have its own issues. They do mention some potential issues and problems, and saying for example that some armies in the game do have a lot harder of a time winning things compared with other factions. I feel like compared with if you went back 5 years in Games Workshop's approach to handling that sort of thing, they really wouldn't have liked to say that the game is in any way imbalanced, even when there's obvious glaring problems. Obviously they're never going to be too critical of Warhammer and how the game is at the moment though, as they are the company that makes it. They're always going to focus a lot more as to the good things that are going on and how they aim to make things better in the future, rather than say if they made a change and it was a bit bad or meaningless. The majority of this article generally talked about the fallout to their data slate changes, which just running through them quickly were basically Tyranids getting nerfed Leviathan and one of their relics. For Harlequins they hit the Sadath of Light, and Necrons they took core away from the Silent King. Besides that they buffed Space Marines and Admech a tiny bit. Admech they made their Vanguard far more useful with a good stratagem, and made Lucius stacking saves a bit better. And for Space Marines they did have a slightly disappointing change in just making a never take secondary into a bit more of a maybe pick, but certainly nothing that's really going to have any real impact on the faction, to be honest. Quite a lot of their discussion centered around talking about the reaction to the balanced data slate, and even though they didn't dwell on it too much, they did say that at least a few people had the reaction of it's a bit underwhelming, particularly for the armies that are struggling the most. And even if they don't focus on the negatives too much, I guess it's kind of good that they acknowledge that. I do maybe feel that the article was maybe written as a little bit of a slight damage control exercise though, and basically just trying to get people on board with making small changes bit by bit, rather than making big sweeping changes that drastically shake up the meta. They gave a bunch of different reasons for not wanting to change things too quickly, such as not wanting to overwhelm people with lots of bolt-on changes in the data slate. They don't want to swing factions too far from either weak to strong or strong to weak. And perhaps above all, they did say that points changes might be a better tool for correcting a lot of factions with balance problems, rather than just adding on a whole host of extra special rules to a faction that maybe didn't need it and just wanted a points change. I feel like the last bit might be the biggest message, and basically say that there'll be a lot more things changing when the points changes come out, but currently it seems to be the case that they only update points every 6 months rather than every 3 months, again probably keeping a bit of a balance between overwhelming people with changes and not doing anything. Otherwise, they talked a little bit about their Kansas City Open tournament, their big grand tournament where the Blood Angels won. I feel like they were quite keen to hold that up as an example of everything going rather well at the moment. Overall, I would say that they're really not entirely wrong to do this, as they do say themselves, and I'd agree with the balance of 40k, at least between factions, is about as good as it's ever been. The vast majority of factions are at least usable versus the vast majority of the other ones, rather than having too many wild outliers that are just off the charts powerful or completely useless. Still though, I'm just not really sure that holding up any one single tournament and saying this is an example of why things are great is really all that helpful maybe. Blood Angels winning is nice, as they're kind of a middling faction at the moment, and they haven't really won very much before, but that's really why it's news that they won, as they're an exception to the rule as opposed to something that happens semi-regularly. On top of that, it maybe doesn't help Space Marines in general, as Blood Angels are arguably one of the strongest chapters right now. There's a whole load of different Space Marine armies that are struggling far more than them, and even the Blood Angels aren't anywhere near the top of the tree. They also mentioned that there weren't any Necrons or Harlequins in the top 10 of the tournament, and they're quite strong armies in general. Again though, I just really wouldn't set too much stock by that at any one event. How many people turn up in the top 10 isn't just an indicator of how strong the factions are, it's also who turns up playing with them on the day, plus a fair bit of bad luck, good luck, and a decent level of randomness as to how well each of the armies do in their given games. And I feel like it's far better to focus on their more normal approach of looking at win rates or how many events or placings they're getting across the board, as opposed to any one event, even if it's a fairly big one. I did find it kind of interesting as well that it kind of underlines that they just really haven't done that much for Space Marines as well, as I believe the winning Blood Angels list didn't make any heavy use of the new Shock Tactics secondary, the one that was buffed to score more victory points, and the only buff that they gave to Space Marines, and they just instead decided to use all the other things, basically implying that the balanced data slate really didn't change much for Space Marines in general. I'm not really trying to be too critical though. I would say that the vast majority of what they said does make sense, and even the balanced data slate changes, even if they were a bit right touch, at least were all changes in the right direction, and a far cry from Games Workshop's points and rules updates going back a few years or so, where you might have things that are getting nerfed that were bad already, or occasionally accidentally buffing things that are some of the strongest things in the game already. I do hope that they manage to go a little bit heavier touch when they do the next one and chapter approved though, as from the discussion they tended to imply that that's where the changes might be coming. Talking of that, in their video discussion they did basically confirm that both points changes and the new data slate will be coming out in January, alongside the new season of 40k with updated missions and things. I wouldn't say it's the biggest news in the world, as it does fit in with their current time schedule, so that's when people were predicting that another one would come out, but it is helpful to know that it is at least targeted for January and not later. It just helps people with timing expectations and knowing when things might be changing for their armies. I would guess that they'll probably go down the previous route that they did with points changes and make the Minotaur and Field Manual points free. Hopefully they've managed to ditch the imprint point system that seems to be really quite out of date at this point. I thought it was quite interesting when they were talking about points changes versus rule changes, that they said that they might prefer to make some slightly bigger changes to factions in points rather than rules. And the reason that they gave was kind of interesting, as making a whole bunch of scattergun changes to points is maybe a bit less mental load, rather than making a whole ton of different rules changes, as that might be a little bit harder to keep track of. With the points changes, you can just work everything out pre-game, and then everything functions as it did in-game. It might just alter how many models that you have on the table or something, or which upgrades that you bring. And I would agree that it's probably a better tool for making, say, internal faction changes that are more aimed at balancing out factions inside the codex rather than against others. There's quite a lot of armies that are within their ideal win percentage rate, where they've got a bunch of units that are just kind of useless at the moment, and I feel like they could probably make really quite a lot of buffs to those units without really affecting the overall win rate of the factions too much. They did also mention that demons were rising up the rankings a fair bit with a lot of successive events, particularly with the Flamers. I feel like the fact that they've called them out by name in one of their Metawatch balancing articles really does imply that they might well get a points bump, as I'm sure a lot of people might be expecting already. In any case, in terms of 40k rules updates, it looks like the only major thing that's happening between then and January is probably going to be the Guard Codex dropping, though I guess they might have some surprises for the game in terms of new models and things with that campaign series that they teased, and that mysterious Archifane Dark Mechanicus character. So anyway, we've got a bit more of a time schedule established there, but I'd be interested to hear your take on Games Workshop's Metawatch. Are you satisfied with their ideas for some light touch balancing and then more with points presumably? And what do you make of their analysis of the recent tournaments and things? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that one linked down in the video description if you're interested. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.